Coming to tonight's session on API product management. Let me give an introduction to our distinguished and eminent speaker of tonight, Jason Knight. Jason is a passionate product management nerd, always curious to learn and understand diverse perspectives and pay it forward to the next generation. By day, he leads the product team at DueDil, a London-based tech startup. By night, he picks up the microphone and interviews a wide range of product management professionals on his podcast, One Night in Product. A very warm welcome to you, Jason. We are thrilled to have you here with us tonight, handing the session over to you now.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear
Super.
you all right.
I am going to share my screen. Oh, no, now I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if you can see that. Let's go into full screen mode, which I should have done before. And also, oh, hang on, wait, sorry. View, full screen. And to hide the tab bar, and to go into full screen mode. There we go, I've done it, super. Cool, right, well, thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me, Sharma. And I've been told that Sharma is gonna tell me off if I speak too quickly. So please do that, because I appreciate that sometimes I do. But tonight, I'm here to give you some thoughts and opinions that I've had from my time working with APIs in product. Hopefully give some of the product leaders on the call some inspiration for their teams and things that they can maybe take back to them, but also to any product practitioners, anyone that's managing direct products and direct user problems, like some ideas for things that they can do to their products as well. So hopefully this will be interesting, and again, happy to answer questions about any of this stuff as well. So we've covered it a little bit, but just in my own words as well, just to kind of set the scene for who I am and why I'm talking to you. So by day, as has been discussed, I head up the product team at a RegTech firm in the UK called DueDil. And what we do is we provide business information data to banks, to financial service providers, to fintechs, to enable them to basically speed up and remove human effort from their onboarding. And by onboarding, we mean the regulatory checks and the risk checks that they have to do when offering services to their customers. Now, that traditionally was a very manual process. What we do now is offer via web app and also enterprise grade API, the ability for them to do that as quickly as possible. So that's where my API experience has really started to take hold. But I don't just do product in the day, as again has been said. I also have so much fun with product management that I like to spend time talking about it. And that's where the podcast comes in. If you like podcasts, then feel free to go and have a listen. We've got some good chats with some interesting practitioners, thought leaders, authors, and also co-founder of a new community called the Product Dynamic, which is much more aimed at trying to foster good working relationships between teams, pushing for diversity and inclusion, and defeating cognitive biases, all these things that get in the way of good product management. So if you're interested in any of those things, I can only encourage you to go and take a look. But that's just me telling you a little bit about me. But the agenda for today is very much focused on API product management and some of the considerations. So there's three key points. Firstly, why do you need to have API products in your portfolio at all? It's a very good question. If you do need them, then some of the principles of UX for those API products. So some of the ways that you may want to think about the actual way that people interact with you. And then a little bit about how to actually land these API products with people that may be not so technical, because you're going to need to get their buy-in too. So first things first, and I know we missed our first poll already, but I think we were going to do a poll around how many people currently have APIs in their product portfolio. So if we can get that poll up, it would be interesting to see like what the API kind of penetration is at the moment. And while that poll is going on, I wanted to spend a little bit of time setting the scene. And by setting the scene, I mean just giving you my opinions about how we're defining some of the things that we're talking about tonight. And some of this will be maybe a little bit obvious to some of you, but I think it's important that we all start on the same page because that will drive some of the things that we're going to talk about. So I just want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the key principles.
Hi, sorry to cut you off, Jason. Just give me
Yes.
one more minute to launch the poll, but please carry on with the session. And
Yep. No problem. So while the poll is getting set up, I mean, we can leave that going for a while. But my first question that I'm going to answer for myself is, what is a product? Now, that is a very interesting question and one that probably has many answers. But I wanted to give my definition so that we could look at things through that lens. So what is a product? Well, a product for me is a tool or a service that solves a problem that exists for many people and solves it in a sustainable and scalable way. And some of these words are very important. Sustainable and scalable, of course, and obviously the problem for many people. I'm not interested in building APIs individually for individual clients because that is a professional services engagement and that is not product management. What I want to do when I'm building APIs is build a solution that works for many people and can be offered at scale because that's how you drive growth for your product. So it's important to consider the scaling part of this, and we'll come back to the scaling a couple of times throughout this as well. So, okay, then, well, what is product management? And again, this is something that I ask people on the podcast. It always gets interesting answers. And also, what is API product management? Now, for me, product management and API product management, whilst the products are different, potentially, the job is the same. And this, again, my definition, it's the practice of deciding the problems that are most important and working with your engineers and stakeholders to build the solutions that work to solve that problem. And there's this typical circle thing. You've probably seen it 100 times before. I've changed the words slightly, but users, commercial, and tech, you're in the middle. You're working with your commercial teams, you're working with your tech teams, and you're working most importantly with your users to understand what's important and then work with everyone to provide the best solution. And in this case, we're going to assume that that best solution is an API. But do API product managers need to be technical? And that's a very good question, and something that is also something that gets asked about any product manager. Like, you don't have to look too far. Maybe you've read Cracking the PM Interview, classic book, which describes how to get a job at Facebook or Microsoft or any of these places. And many of these big tech firms in Silicon Valley will give product managers coding tests. Now, I am not going to say that that's wrong, but it's certainly not something that I believe in. I don't believe that product managers need to be overly technical. They need to understand technology, but they don't need to be developers. And it's the same for API product managers, in my opinion. So product managers don't need to write or build APIs. If they came from technology backgrounds, maybe they have that skill set, but it's not a requirement. They've got an engineering team for that. They don't need to worry about the languages that are being used or the protocols or the implementation details or any of the technical details in the back because they've got an engineering team for that. It's the engineering team's job in a properly empowered product organization to handle that. But let's face it, you need to be able to understand your own product. So you do need to be able to understand how to interact with an API, and you do need to understand how to send requests and receive responses and read the responses from an API. So there is some level of expertise needed around that, but that is something that you can pick up quite easily with very little fuss. And you also need to be able to explain APIs to various stakeholders, because again, that's a critical part of any product manager's job. You need to be able to explain your product and the value that it brings and the way that it brings that value. So you do need to be able to explain it, and you do need to be able to use them, but you definitely don't need to be able to build them. But let's just focus again on another fundamental. Well, what is an API? Now, I'm sure many of you know what an API is, so I don't want to labor this one too much, but I will try to use, in the spirit of explaining to non-technical users, a little hobby of mine is to use an imperfect analogy. So by that, I mean something...
sorry again, but I think it's the right time to ask the poll. Should I launch the poll?
Oh, yeah. Have we got
an
responses?
idea of whether our audience has a portfolio background or not, product.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So audience, please go ahead and cast your votes right away. Let us know if you are already aware of the APIs or not.
All right, looks like I'm preaching to the converted already. And there's one person who obviously come to the wrong webinar.
So I guess the majority says yes, they already have an idea of API in product portfolio today.
That's interesting though, because one of my upcoming slides will be about the types of API, and I'm curious as to whether some of those are APIs that are for internal use or for external use, but we can worry about that later. But it's good to see that we've got clear interest in APIs though, and clear implementation of APIs,
Sure.
Which may make this next bit a little bit irrelevant, but let's just go for it anyway. Because I do like to use what I call an imperfect analogy to explain technical details to people who maybe aren't technical. So obviously we are, but let's imagine that we're not, or that we had to explain an API to my mum or to my kids. So my imperfect analogy is I've gone to a restaurant. I must emphasize, by the way, that I had to draw these pictures because I couldn't find any good ones. So apologies for the quality of the pictures. But there's me sitting at a restaurant, pretty hungry, and I want to order some food. To order that food, I'm going to speak to the waiter, who's going to check that that food's on the menu and take that order to the kitchen, where I never, by the way, I'm a user, I'm the customer. I never see the kitchen, of course, but the waiter goes to the kitchen, speaks to the chef gets the order, prepares the meal from the ingredients that she has in the kitchen, calls the waiter, gives them the food, waiter takes the food back to the table, and finally the hungry customer gets to eat their food and the transaction is over. Now you can probably see where this is going, but just for the record, that is basically the same basic transaction that you might consider from an API. So my user, the hungry person, is sending a request to an API. That API is the waiter is going to check that that's a valid request and send that valid request to the back end or the kitchen. The chef or the back end is going to receive that request, compose a response from the data that's available to her, and so you're going to send that response straight back via the waiter, who will send that response on to the user, who will then consume and use that data. So it's basically the same thing. And this is an explanation, I think, that anyone that's been to a restaurant should be able to understand. So I think it's handy to have that as a concept, but also just to explain as well, there are many types of API interaction that are much more complicated than this, but this is the basic version that you could maybe scribble down on a piece of paper to show your mum. But what's an API product? Well, an API product is one or more API endpoints that solve a user problem. And this is important because it's very easy to think of an API as just a technical implementation, throwing some data on a screen. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But ultimately, an API product is a set of API endpoints that solve a user problem. Now, that could involve importing data into your system. It could involve exporting data from your system, and many other things besides. But the ultimate point is that this is an implementation of a use case that delivers value to many users. Now, how you sell that, of course, is a whole different discussion. For example, you could sell that as a standalone product. You could bundle that with other offerings that you have. So, for example, maybe you have a web application that you could sell and bundle it, or maybe you bundle it around use cases, or maybe you bundle it specifically around the implementations. These are all pricing discussions and go-to-market discussions, which the product team should absolutely be involved in. I just want to emphasize that there are many ways to take those to market. So we've now aligned on what a product is, or what I think a product is anyway, what an API product manager does, whether an API product manager needs to be a developer or very technical, and what an API product is. So now let's go and think about some of the things that we need to consider when we're talking about API products. So first, the question that we have to ask in the first area is, well, why do you need APIs in your product portfolio? Now, this is a question, I guess, from the poll that maybe some of you have already answered. But I think we still need to consider, like, why do you need to have APIs in your product portfolio? And the first question you have to ask is, well, do I need to have APIs in my product portfolio? Now, you might not. it's perfectly valid to not have APIs in your product portfolio. Maybe you've got other stuff that you need to fix that's more important than having an API in your product. Maybe you have a very visual product that's very user interface visually important, and you're spending all of your time and effort on that. Maybe you just generally have other business priorities. But most importantly, you don't need an API in your product if you don't have users that want an API. Again, we need to look at this from a product management angle. The only reason to put an API into your product is if your users need it and it solves a problem for them. You definitely shouldn't make an API because the CEO read an article, or because your competitor just released one, or because generally you have a fear of missing out, because that is a bad reason to build any product, including an API. So the golden rule of product management is always don't build stuff for the sake of it. You build stuff because your users need it. Now, you may also already have APIs, and according to the poll, many of you do. Now, that is obviously very common. For example, if you have some kind of web application, if you have a mobile app, if you have any kind of system that integrates with your own data, you almost certainly have some kind of API feeding that, because that's how you get the data from your backend into your own application. So you could just sit there and think, well, let's sell that API to our clients. That's a good idea, right? I would emphasize that you should probably exercise some caution around that, because there are many reasons why an internal API is not necessarily ready for public consumption. There may be a lack of documentation. It's very common for internal projects to not be documented to a standard that you might expect from a public product that you'd be taking to the market. There may be a lack of consistency or design, because ultimately, if your developers are building API endpoints to serve a front end that they also develop, they can fix some of the stuff in the front end. They don't need to make it consistent. They don't need to make it all hang together. So it might not be a consistent set of endpoints. It could have just been pulled together over many years with no design thinking. You could also have issues around security and scalability and loads of things that just didn't get thought about. So whilst it's possible that your internal API is 100% acceptable for that external use case, you got to think about it and not just be forced into pushing that straight out, because that is an important thing to consider. When you scale this, you need to be ready to do that. So then there's this concept which I basically stole from a wonderful book called Crossing the Chasm, which many of you may have seen or heard of. It's a classic book about selling technical solutions into the marketplace and the difficulties of landing with clients and customers in the mainstream markets. A very good book, definitely recommend reading it. But one of the concepts from this book is this whole product concept. And this whole product concept is the idea that your product is more than just your technical implementation. It's also the entire experience that you have from start to finish and everything around it. Now, where I'm going with this is that your product that you're offering at the moment almost certainly doesn't do everything that your users might want. It's going to hopefully do all of the things that they want to do that you do, but it doesn't necessarily do everything that they're going to do before and afterwards to solve the problem that you're trying to help them solve. Also, people don't like logging into loads of tools. I certainly don't. I don't like having to remember logins and URLs and bookmarking things. I want to have a unified experience as much as possible. So that's important for me. And ultimately, your product has to be easy to consume, because the easier your product is to consume and to use, the more likely people are to buy it. So why do I need APIs? Well, again, can you honestly say your product solves every problem? Now, there are two reasons why your product can't solve every problem. One of which is if you're a small company, if you're a startup or even a scale up, resources are going to dictate that you have to put your focus somewhere. Generally, you're going to slice and pick a certain part of the market or a certain part of a problem to solve, or you're going to solve it in a very specific way, because you don't have the resource to do that for everything. And if you try to do everything, then you're going to fail and the company's going to be in trouble. Although some people obviously try. If you're a massive company, a big enterprise, then you probably have lots of resource, but some of the things that you might want to solve do not make any sense for your company to try to solve, because there are either startups that do it better, or just there are too many things. And there's another classic book by Clayton Christensen called The Innovators Dilemma, which explains in detail how there are many use cases that big companies, it just doesn't make sense for them to solve. And this is where small companies have the opportunity. Now, in some cases, those small companies, like say Netflix, smash the big companies to pieces, because actually by the time they grew, it was too late for the big company to respond. And that's a different talk for a different day. But the point is, your product is never going to solve every problem. So you build what I like to refer to as on-ramps and off-ramps, like on a highway. This is an ugly picture, so I do apologize. Your product is only going to be a part of someone's journey for the most part. So rather than making it hard for people to get stuff in and out, export CSVs, paste things into boxes, type stuff in again, it's like, no. As best as possible, you should focus on getting in or on and off of the highway, which is your product, as seamlessly as possible, because again, that makes it more likely that people are going to want to buy you because it's less stress for them. And again, though, the golden rule of product management, don't build stuff just for the sake of it. You can only build and sell and deliver API solutions if it makes sense for your users. But it's also important to consider that it's not just about users directly consuming APIs. There's also a partnership angle here. So for example, let's imagine I'm a company that builds machine learning generated advertising copy. I think there are some companies that do that now. That's fine. I'm a startup. I can build that and I can push that out, and that could be a standalone tool. But there's lots of stuff around other platforms that can do more stuff with advertising than maybe you want to support. In which case, it can make a lot of sense not only to consider APIs as a direct user play, but also as a partnership play, and making APIs available so that you can partner and become part of an ecosystem. Going back to this whole product model, you can start to become an essential part of an ecosystem. And again, that can help to drive growth and drive revenue opportunities, because you're making yourself indispensable as part of a wider play without having to build it all yourself. So if we assume then that we did loads of good discovery and we found out that our users really need to have some APIs of some sort, we need to consider UX principles for APIs. So there's a bit of information here about some of the words that you may see flying around with regards to APIs. And again, you don't need to be able to develop an API to make a product out of them or to build a value proposition, but you do need to understand what some of the terms mean and what impact they may have on the user experience. So for example, there are various types of API, all that have different ways to interact with them. SOAP is an older protocol, which I don't think is that popular anymore. You may see it flying around. REST is very common and very simple, but has its detractors. GraphQL is a new query language and framework offered by Facebook, which has got a lot of developer buzz at the moment, and lots of people are trying to use that themselves. You can also consider things like streaming APIs, so sort of APIs that set up a connection to somewhere and they have effectively a pipe that stuff can go backwards and forwards along pretty much on demand. Or you can consider stateless APIs, where you just make a request, it goes to somewhere, the data comes back and you're done, very atomic. And you can consider the types of data that you can provide via an API. So you can provide binary data, so like PDF files, you can provide videos and audio files and all other different types of content. You can send down simple CSV files. You can send down XML files. It tends not to be so popular these days. Or the big one, which generally everyone seems to like, and definitely my favorite data format is JSON. That is definitely the one that you tend to see the most. And also remember that these data can go in and out. If you'll remember, you've got on-ramps and off-ramps that you can consume data in, you can push data out, you can build APIs to accept data, you can build APIs to send data. But the most important thing, and I'll say there are loads of options, the most important thing and this isn't just an API thing, by the way, the most important thing for any product is that you don't need to know every last bit of detail, because ultimately it's not necessarily about using the latest, greatest technology that you can find. It's no good me putting a product out into the market with some new 5-dimensional holographic API interface that only 3 people in the world know about, because my audience or my market for that is basically those 3 people. I need to build using the right technology that solves the problem for the right users. So, for example, GraphQL is a very exciting newish technology, but not everyone can integrate with that. So maybe they want to use something different. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, no API is any good unless you're solving an actual problem for people that can actually integrate with you. But we should reflect, like, well, who are our users? Now, there's 2 ways to look at this. In one way, you could consider, well, your users are the users of the system that integrated with you. So, for example, DueDil, we work with banks and financial services companies. Our banks or our banking clients will integrate with us and our API, and that will be integrated into some banking system that they are responsible for, and that is what then is presented to the bank's customers. Generally speaking, we don't get to see that interface because, of course, we don't work for the bank. We have an API and we have our own web platform to support that as well. But most of the time, what we're doing and focusing on is making sure that our API has the right data in it, that it's responsive, that it has all of the functionality that's needed, and that the banks can consume that as easily as possible. But it's absolutely not our job to worry about the implementation details of the UI of the bank's systems, because that's their job. So what we're going to be doing is talking a lot to developers, to systems integrators, and to product managers, or if it's not a product company, maybe a project manager or implementation manager or someone who's responsible for that system. So you could think, well, that's fine. We're working with developers. Let's just give them anything. And that is definitely something that does happen, but you need to think again. There's a couple of reasons. First of all, they're not all developers. Sometimes you're going to be working these days with no-code practitioners, people that are using some of the top up-and-coming no-code platforms, which are getting better and better all the time, or they're using canned integrations in CRMs or other systems, BI systems and so forth. You can do a lot with these systems, but they're no way a replacement for actual developers, because actual developers can do everything. Anything in an interface is always going to be naturally limited. It has to be. So it matters that you are providing a response that can actually be consumed. I've heard of examples where API responses are so complicated, or the workflows are so convoluted, that it's almost impossible to manage those in a no-code or, say, a CRM platform. And we need to consider this because, again, we need to be easy to consume. Otherwise, people aren't going to want to consume us. So you might sit there and think, well, do APIs have an interface? I mean, there's no visual element to an API, right? But actually, the clue's in the name. API stands for an application programming interface. It has an interface, but you're right, it's not visual. But we still need to consider the journey that a user takes to get to our API and to interact with the data that we send back. No. So let's imagine a toy example where I've got some kind of task system, which I want to have an API to enable people to consume this data. And I might have like a table of users, table of tasks, table of reminders, all linked together, stored in 3 tables. But my company's not very successful yet, so I've only got 1 row in each of those. But you can see the basic idea. There's me. I've got a task that's registered against my ID, and I've got a reminder that's registered against that task. We can leave aside whether that's the best design for this system. That's the one that I've gone with. So you could say, well, fine, we're working with developers. Let's just throw the data at them. So my developer will call out to the user's endpoint, and they get a bit of data back with my user details in. Okay, so now they need to go and get tasks, and then they'll get some information about the task for that user, and they'll get that back. And then you say, okay, fine, well, now I'm going to go and get my reminders. Okay, they get the reminders back. But the users are starting to get a little bit annoyed now because we're putting a lot of work on their shoulders. Now, this is a simple example, so not that much work, but we're putting a lot of work on their shoulders to do something that should be pretty simple. Why are we making them call 3 endpoints to do one thing? All they care about is the result, not writing loads of code to get it. And again, we have to consider that we have potentially stretched dev teams with a lack of resource. They may have multiple competing priorities from their side, and we may also have people using no-code platforms or CRM integrations, BI connectors to get this done. So we need to consider not just what's easiest for our developers to put into an API endpoint or what's easiest compared to how the data is stored, because actually it doesn't matter how the data is stored. It matters how the data needs to be used. And that's a very important consideration. Like, we're focusing on the use case, not just on throwing data at people. So again, this is a simple example, but maybe we just go and call a different endpoint, which is focused on the use case of getting a user's task list. And it just sends all the data back in one lump. The users have to do a lot less work to integrate that. They still have to do potentially some work because obviously they need to map this into some other system, but it's all in one place. They don't have to worry about that anymore. Now, there's also, we talked about in the restaurant example earlier, like the waiter looks at a menu to understand whether this is something that they even sell. In API world, we're talking about API documentation. And I would say that, again, we mentioned earlier, not all internal APIs will have documentation, but external APIs absolutely 100% have to have documentation. They need to show people how they can interact with the API, and they need to be kept up to date and as detailed as necessary to get that done, because you are going to be unable to scale your product, your API product, if you don't have good supporting documentation, because then you're going to need to have your staff go and basically help people integrate with their systems, and that cannot scale. If you want to have thousands of users, you need to have robust API documentation that explains all of the data that it accepts and all of the data that it sends back, and gives people as much of a chance as possible. Now, you can auto-generate these, that's fine. There are tools that enable you to manage this, but without this, you're always limiting the amount that this product can grow. And I would say personally that whilst it may not be as important as the actual functionality, it is a very close second to have good, robust API documentation that describes your API and replicates this menu approach that we're talking about. There are a few other small considerations that we won't go to in detail, but one very important thing is that if you're an API product, people are integrating with you into their systems. And that means you don't want to break anything. If you break things, you're breaking them, not just yourself. So you need to be able to have an API that is robust enough that you can ensure that if you make any changes, that you're not breaking anything, and have your engineering team set up sufficient tests to understand whether any changes are breaking. And if you do have to implement such changes, start considering things like versioning, depending on the type of API, so that you can understand, well, okay, fine, we need to make a certain change. It could be considered a breaking change, but that's a different version. And therefore, people don't get put onto this new version by mistake. They have to change to it, and therefore they get no surprises. The same with request validation. Again, the menu shows you what types of requests you can make. The documentation shows you the requests that you can make. Getting back some generic error code when something goes wrong is not very useful. You need these people to understand what went wrong, whether they sent something in incorrect, whether they missed out a field, because again, without this, the only option they have is to come back to your customer success team or your integration team or whatever team. And again, that limits your ability to scale. You also need to consider rate limits and quotas and load testing, but more importantly, you need to have an uptime SLA as well, because again, you're integrating with these systems. If your system goes down, their system goes down. So you need to have robust enterprise-grade APIs and an SLA to support them. Final quick section is around landing API products with non-technical stakeholders. We've been talking a lot about developers and nearly developers and integrators and people like that, but there's another layer of people that you have to impress. And those people are non-technical, potentially management or exec teams, leadership in these companies. And it's not just a case of trying to impress them. In many cases, these are going to be the people that actually have the budget to buy your system. So without impressing these people, you might not even get bought in the first place. And that could cost you a lot of money. So you need to be able to land this with them effectively. So if you're demoing APIs to a technical user, a techie, you'd use something like Postman. Now, Postman's a great tool. I have it. I've got all of our API endpoints in there, all set up so that I can basically test anything whenever I want. It's a fantastic tool. It's free. You can download it, set up all your API endpoints, send the messages off, get the responses. And if you want to use that to demo it to technical users or even to curious non-technical users, you absolutely can use that. And that's an essential part of any API product manager's toolkit. But I will also say that most non-technical people have never, ever heard of this tool. And they're never going to hear of this tool. And if they did have it, they probably wouldn't want to use it because it's a different world. It's not a bad world. It's just not their world. So you need to find a way to demonstrate the value to them as well. So if you happen to have a web app, as we do, that mirrors the functionality of your API, then of course you can just use that. If it literally is feature equivalent, then you can use the same web app to give a visual representation of exactly what your API is doing and try and get that wow moment with these stakeholders to ensure that they understand the value that your solution is going to bring to them. If you don't have a web app or any kind of app visual that mirrors the API functionality, and it's not uncommon, like some people don't have web apps at all. Some people, maybe their web app is a simplified version and their API is much more detailed. If you don't have such a thing, then you should strongly consider some form of visual mock-up, prototype, or demo framework. Now, I like to tell a story here about a company called Domo. Now, I have to emphasize that Domo are not paying for this, and therefore I have to also emphasize that there are many other business intelligence tools out there, like Tableau or Power BI or Click. This is just one of many options. But the reason I bring them up is because they did a really interesting thing. It's not really a prototype, but it was definitely an interesting thing. So Domo are a BI tool. And like all BI tools, they have to have the ability to bring data in and export data out of their system. Now, to do that, they have a whole data warehousing. There's a video on YouTube. You can go and look and see exactly what I'm talking about. The interesting thing they did was instead of, for example, having a boring table of all of the different pipelines and dates and numbers and statuses and stuff like that, they made this amazing 3D rotating hemisphere with all of the different data endpoints as little dots and all these streams going up and around and above, the big fat streams for big data and little tiny streams for thin data. Now, functionally, that was probably no more useful than that table. But at the same time, every single person that ever looked at that was amazed. They were wowed. And the reason that something like this is important is because you can immediately grasp the concept of what's happening. You don't have to explain that at all. It's very visual and people just understand. And that's why I'm saying pictures speak 1,000 pictures, which speak 1,000. So you're speaking 1,000,000 words in this situation without having to say anything. So build something visual, because that's a way to get non-technical users to understand the value that your API product will bring. You should make it look like a system that the client understands. So for example, with us, we work with banks. Therefore, make a banking thing that looks like a banking system. Or if you're working with a BI tool, same type of thing. If you're working with any CRM, make something that looks a bit like a CRM. We're not talking about spending months building an actual production quality product that you're actually going to sell to people. But what we are talking about is having a way to give non-technical stakeholders that immediate light bulb moment so they can understand, again, the wow moment. They understand the value immediately of what you're offering, because that can save a lot of conversations. That can also be used as a really helpful sales and pre-sales tool and enable you to start bringing those deals home. So you should absolutely consider that, in my opinion. I think we were going to do another poll now about whether people have been convinced by my rambling, and if people want to do an API now, although actually given how many people already had them, I guess it would be interesting to know if that's changed or if we've still got some no's. I emphasize I don't work for the big API company, so it's not, I don't make any more. One person. My work here has failed. So to wrap up, biggest job of any PM is to solve a user's problem, not to just build things for the sake of it and not to build vanity projects. You want to make sure that you're solving an important problem using whatever tools you have available to you. And obviously one of those tools is an API, and you should absolutely use that if that suits your users and the use cases that you're trying to solve. But you absolutely have to think about how your users are consuming the content and make it as easy as possible for them to do so, because the easier you make it for them to do it, the much more likely it is for them to actually buy it and continue to subscribe to it once they've bought it, because their frustration will be minimized. And also making sure that you can land it not just with your users, but with your customers. So the non-technical people, that may well be the difference between you winning that deal or not. And that, I believe, is me. So happy, obviously, to take a bunch of questions now. If there's anything come up, I've seen there's a few things in the chat, which I can't actually see at the moment. But also happy after this to, if anyone wants to connect on LinkedIn or Twitter, you can do that. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. I'm always happy to chat about products pretty much all the time. So happy to take any questions after this, but also happy to take questions now.
Thank you, Jason, for delivering a brilliant session and really great insights, thought-provoking insights. And I'm sure the audience feels the same, because there are so many questions lined up for you already in the Q&A window. So let me share my screen. You can have a look at the questions meanwhile.
Sure, let me unshare my screen.
So audience, please go ahead and ask your questions in the Zoom Q&A window if you have not already, or in the LinkedIn thread, and we'll direct them to the speaker. So Jason, let's take this first question by Amit. Building an API first product versus adding API as an afterthought needs completely consideration. What are some of the considerations for an API first product?
Yeah, so again, if we take this back to general product principles, the most important thing is to understand what is the best way to solve your users' problem. So obviously, I think, like, for example, you get people like Stripe who I believe is entirely API based, because they're a payments company and it doesn't really make sense for them to have like a big exciting UI. What they need to do is build the integrations, and they need to build APIs to enable those integrations. So ultimately it just boils down to, I mean, I agree that adding APIs afterwards and retrofitting, I mean, it's definitely possible, but you need to really think about it. I would say you just need to think about, how do your users need to interact with your product, with your data? And yeah, product discovery is something that you're going to need to do there to understand and do your interviews, find out the problems that you can solve with your data, and then understand then how people want to interact with it. Because if they want to interact with it through a user interface, like a graphical user interface, then that should come out of those interviews. If they don't, and actually what they're mainly concerned around is the end-to-end integrations and the pipelines that they can set up off of it and stuff like that, again, that should be surfaced through those interviews. So yeah, I mean, for me, it's all about what is the focus of, or the most value you can deliver from your data, and what is the expression of that actually represents the wishes of most of your users.
Great. So Amit, I hope that answers your question. Please let us know your thoughts in the chat window. Now going to the next question. This is from Rakshit. What are the tools used to manage and maintain the structure and details of the API endpoint?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, when it comes to designing API endpoints, that's again very much around working out what the data is that you hold and what the most effective way to represent that data is to, give to the audience that actually want to consume it. When it comes to the technicalities of managing and maintaining that structure, again, if we think of, for example, the open API stuff, the documentation standards that you have, there are ways to, I don't want to get too technical because again, that's an engineering discussion, but there are ways to decorate your API endpoints in such a way that you can generate the documentation from them using tools like Swagger. And that then enables you to always maintain that structure and the documentation and the details and the data formats and the accepted responses and requests and stuff like that. These are all possible to manage through the code itself, but actually designing the structure and the data of the endpoints is much more around, I guess, more of a product management / user discussion to sit there and say, okay, well, what data do you need? And of course, you'll be working with your engineers at the same time because your engineers will be able to inform you as to any considerations around data formats or any limitations or things like pagination that they might need to put in there or any kind of design considerations that are more technically driven. So I think that part is very much a discussion, but the actual technical side of it is very much around making sure that the engineering team culturally want to get those endpoints documented and maintained, and then making sure that they use the right markup to enable that to be managed going forward.
Great. Thank you, Rakshit, for that question. So this next question is from Ian Bennett. Is there a difference between storing the XML JSON response, I'm sorry if I'm saying it wrong, response from an API as opposed to just displaying it? Does the receiving system always have to do development in the backend to consume the data from the API response?
Well, if you want to do something with that data and store it, then obviously you'll need to store it somewhere. You can just store it as effectively a blob, as in whatever data you get back, just store it. Now, the good thing about JSON responses, for example, is that there are lots of databases that natively support JSON. I mean, there are ones that support XML too, but so, for example, if I launch a request off to some API and get a JSON response back, I can store that in, I don't know, MongoDB or something like that, and it will just store it as JSON, and then I can query it from that database directly. Or you can do loads of post-processing work and combine it with other stuff and store it in some other format, and that, of course, is very much dependent on the use case. But I'd say that generally speaking, the easiest option is just to dump the data you receive into some kind of NoSQL schemaless database. That's the minimum that you need to do. But of course, that presupposes that you actually need to do that. If you just want to, for example, I don't know, ping Facebook's API and get some data back and just present it on the screen, then of course you don't need to store it. In fact, you should never store anything that you don't need. So yeah, I'd say it very much depends on use case, but there are plenty of ways to store the types of data that you'll generally get back in a fairly lightweight and easy to manage fashion.
Next question is from Abhilash. What kind of metrics do you use to track the success of your API product? Metrics like time spent per session, DAU, LTV, etc. may not be applicable to API product. Any specific metrics you recommend for API product?
Yeah, this is really interesting actually, because you're right that it's not quite the same. So one of the things that I've considered with our API, for example, is that number of API hits is a very imperfect metric. And the reason that it's imperfect is I can make that number go up very easily by just making more API endpoints and splitting data up, kind of like I said not to do earlier. So for example, those 3 endpoints in that example are going to have 3 times as many hits as the one endpoint, which will give a better experience. So things like number of hits, generally speaking, I don't really like as a metric. It's important as a performance metric so that you can sit there and say, oh yeah, well, we might need to add more servers or something like that because we've got 3 million hits now instead of 1 million hits or whatever the number is. I think for me, the most important thing is to identify what of your offering represents a unit of value. And by unit of value, I mean, what does success look like? And success could mean making one API hit rather than 100, and that's absolutely fine. So, for example, if you're looking at getting data from a system to make decisions around some of the, for example, with us, we're hitting companies, or we're returning data about companies, like maybe the number of companies that you request is an important number to track, a proxy for success, because the more companies people are looking up, the more value you have to assume they're getting from it. But I also do agree that, for example, the concept of, say, a North Star metric is tricky when you're working with integrations, because you don't always know what happens to the data once it's gone, because it's gone to someone else's system now, and the decisions that they make off of that, unless you offer like pingbacks and stuff like that, aren't necessarily going to be ones that are available to you. So I think trying to identify that unit of value, whatever that is for your product, and trying to track that, it may not be perfect. You may need to revisit it, but it's definitely a good start to try and focus on something to measure and see what happens to that number. And it could be, for example, that number is just really fuzzy and random because people are just have different usage patterns. But ultimately, you want to assume that if there's a type of value that you can deliver, be it companies returned or transactions monitored or whatever else, that number will go up the more people use your systems and the more value they get, because the more value they get, the more they're going to want to use it.
Great. Thank you, Abhilash. And thank you, audience, for the engagement and the great questions that you're asking. We'll try and take as many in the time that permits. But coming to the next question here, this is from Gaurav. How do you make sure that APIs are secure? Is using API gateways and token generation the only good way to access securely? What about the security when API used from one product in other products interface? Please share the best practices.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, a lot of the best practices are going to be much more engineering focused, and I definitely wouldn't want to take credit away from them. But I mean, obviously, API keys are a fairly universal way and fairly easy to understand, where you generate keys for people. Ideally, those keys would have an expiration date so that you could renew them and that they don't just sit there forever. Potentially, they would be tied to specific use cases, and you obviously really want to make sure that the users are interacting with your system in a controlled fashion. So you may end up putting certain permissions around those keys. So not just having just a one size fits all key that anyone, put a key in and then that key just gives them access to everything. You may want to do traditional user access management groups and roles and stuff like that. And these share many concepts with just general any product, right? I mean, any system that you can log into has some concept of permissions, and that is important to consider. Now, there are more complicated things and that you can do with regards to using OAuth or something like that to start doing call and response, or requesting keys and getting back security tokens and stuff like that. There's loads of ways to do it. I'd hesitate to recommend a specific best practice, but I think that the most important thing is to do it really purposefully. So not just to copy and paste some code from an API website or whatnot, but to actually think about what are you trying to achieve? Like, how much does it matter that people have or don't have all you can eat access versus very specific controlled access? And also, how do you monitor your keys? So for example, if you're tracking your API requests, then you can get the engineering team to put that data into a dashboard somewhere, so you can start to understand both usage, as in just how much stuff is being used, but also patterns of usage that start to look very strange. Like, for example, denial of service requests or massive uptick in endpoints that people haven't used before, and start to analyze those and understand what's driving usage, what accounts may or may not be at risk, and so forth. So I think ultimately there are many ways to do this, but I would say that API keys and having good, robust API key management and permissions built around that would be a good starting point.
Amazing. Great. Thank you, Gaurav, for that question. The next question is from Rohit. You mentioned that startups can probably be a part of bigger ecosystem. However, what if the bigger ecosystem is always on the lookout for good performing APIs? That is, when they see the product market fit, the bigger ecosystem, that is a big company, just goes ahead and either buys the API or creates its own API and replaces the startup's API. How can a small startup protect itself from this situation?
Yeah, I mean, this is the whole thing around the big battleships versus the speedboats, right? I mean, I think you're right that is always a risk, but that's always a risk in any type of product management, right? I mean, ultimately, if you're a startup, you can always be bought if someone throws enough money at you, and if your leadership team accepts the terms. You can always be copied. And obviously one way to be difficult to copy is to come up with something so bespoke or with a patent on it or something like that, that's just either impossible or legally tricky to copy. But that doesn't work for everyone. I think ultimately the benefits that startups have, as we all know, is that they, generally speaking, are faster, more nimble, and more able to get stuff done in a much more effective way than some of these big companies for whom this is just one of many things that they're looking at. You know, there are many enterprises out there that try to do the same things as startups, and they fail time and time again, either because they're not set up for it, or culturally, as in work culture, they just don't have the right processes in place, or they don't have the right trust in their teams to build some of these solutions, or they're unable to put the investments into the right area. So you should be very conscious, not just for APIs, but just for any product. You should always be conscious of the competitive landscape, because no company, big or small, is going to sit there and get excited that someone is competing with it on one of its use cases. So I would say the biggest way that you can try to get past this is to innovate and use the speed and flexibility of being in a smaller company to try to outmaneuver the big companies, because I don't think this is an API problem. I think this is just a general problem.
Jason, if you have a few more minutes for us, we could take 2 more questions if that's okay.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So this next question is from Joe. Do you think API product teams need a product designer in the team, or someone who will focus on the user experience of consuming the API?
I don't think it hurts. I mean, I don't know if all teams have that. I mean, we don't have a product designer right now, for example, so we're having to do that design ourselves. And obviously, I think in many ways, having a product designer is always amazing, because you want to have that design thinking and the design theory behind you. Obviously critical for graphical sort of user interface products, but it's also critical for just anything that you want users to interact with, which is, of course, everything. If you don't have them because of either budget or organizational issues, then that's something that you'll have to either, you know, it's kind of a best efforts thing, right? You'll sit there and you say, okay, well, fine, we understand this is important. We don't have a designer, therefore we'll at least try and do the basics of good product design thinking. That's not going to replace having a designer, but at the same time, at least you're going to be thinking about the same things and trying your best to make something. And I think ultimately the most important thing is try and put yourself in the shoes of the people that are consuming it. So don't just, oh, I don't have a designer, therefore we're just going to just throw out whatever's easiest, because that's not something any product manager should expect. So try and stick to the principles, get the designer when you can, but also obviously depends on the availability of API savvy designers in your town or your city or wherever. You know, there might not be people that, or the supply may be rather limited. So yeah, you have to be very conscious of the fact that if you can't have it, you at least want to keep some of the same principles in place.
Right. I haven't acknowledged the LinkedIn viewers. So here's a question from one of the LinkedIn viewers, Sumit. What is your most difficult challenge you faced building an API product? And I think that's the best question to close this session with.
The biggest challenge in building an API product. Again, I think it's actually building APIs, without wishing to cheapen the work of anyone that's built them, but like building APIs isn't that hard. It's no harder than building any other type of product. The only difficulties are obviously if you don't have knowledge of APIs, like if you've never seen an API before, then of course it will be tricky to start with. But I think that fundamentally, the biggest challenge with building API products is the same as the biggest challenge of building any type of product. And that is simply making sure that what you're building makes sense for as many people as possible, and that you're really focusing on getting the value out of it and not just taking the easy option, i.e. throwing data on a screen, and that you're not making those assumptions and that you're not building things that people don't need. And again, that's a universal problem for any product. So it's definitely not limited to APIs, but the actual fundamentals of making an API are certainly no more complicated than making any product. But you do need to make sure that you've always got that user focus, because APIs are very technical. they're consumed by technical users, and you want to make sure that you're not taking the easy way out simply because you think that these people can just handle it, because they probably can, but they might not want to.
Great. In view of the time constraints, we will have to end the Q&A here, audience. And thanks for the participation. The engagement was great, and so was the session. So for any further questions, you can connect with Jason over LinkedIn or other mediums, if that's okay with you, Jason.
100%. As I say, I'm always delighted to talk to people about any of this stuff. I probably need to get a hobby that isn't my job, but at the same time, I find it all fascinating. So I'm absolutely happy to connect to anyone that wants, and we can chat after this.
Yes, we have plenty of unanswered questions here, so I'll try and mail them to you, Jason.
Sure.
And yeah, we can get answers to that. Or audience, please go ahead and get in touch with Jason over LinkedIn. And also, please scan the QR code to get an exclusive 30-minute session with industry practitioners like Jason to clear all your doubts on product management. So, and now for the final and most exciting part of the session, I request Jason to please help us pick the champion of curiosity, who will be awarded with the free digital course offered by the Institute. So, if you can see the answered questions and the open questions, any question that you think is the best question. I know I'm putting you in a spot here, but please go ahead and pick the question.
Best question.
I mean, if you think you remember some question, then you can tell me, then I can just pick the winner. Yeah,
no, I think, there's obviously some great questions, but I think the question that I thought was very interesting was the one from Rohit about the bigger ecosystem and getting bought and being replaced and stuff like that. I mean, whether or not I answered it perfectly, but I definitely think it was an interesting and thought-provoking question.
So that question would be from Rohit Nagpal.
That's the one.
Right. Yeah. So Rohit, congratulations on winning the free digital course. We'll get in touch with you shortly. We have enjoyed having you with us, Jason. It's been a complete pleasure. Please accept the certificate of appreciation from the Institute, a small gesture. So if you scan the QR code on the certificate, it will take you to a dedicated Hall of Fame page that we have created for you that will hold the recording of this session. Please share it within your network and we'll do the same. We'll be sharing this session recording on YouTube.
Excellent. Sounds good. Thank you very much for having me. I hope it was
useful. We're grateful
useful.
For your time and effort, Jason. You took to share your thoughts and amazing insights drawn from your years of experience in the industry. And I'm certain that our audience will definitely benefit from the methods you suggested and get ahead in their career. Thank you once again for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Good evening.
And audience, thank you for joining in. It was great interacting with you all. Do not forget to register for the webinar on 23rd of June. And with that note, I end tonight's session. Happy learning and stay skilled. Have a great night.